so much, everyone, for taking the time out of your busy schedules to attend this session. My name is Jack. I'm a librarian here with the Sunnyvale Public Library. I am very pleased to welcome you to this program to discuss the history of wildfire management in the United States. To present this evening, we have a very special guest. He is a professor of environmental analysis and history at Pomona College, as well as the author of the book Burn Scars, a documentary history of fire suppression from colonial origins to the resurgence of cultural burning. Dr. Char Miller is here with us tonight. Thank you so much for lending your expertise to this program, Dr. Miller.
Thank
Welcome.
you. Thank you. Great to be here.
Just a tad bit more about Dr. Miller. He is a senior fellow at the Pinchot Institute for Conservation, a corresponding member of the Society of American Foresters, as well as a fellow of the Forest History Society. As an award-winning teacher and writer, too, his work reflects his fascination with all things environmental, with his work being featured in the Los Angeles Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, among many other publications. So, before I have Dr. Miller introduce himself, once again, we do ask that you turn off your camera and mute yourself during the presentation. If you have any questions, please feel free to place them in the chat, and we'll make sure to attend those towards the end of the talk. With that, Dr. Miller, I will let you take it from here whenever you are ready.
Thank you so much, Jack. And thank you all so much for coming in and around dinner hour. I really appreciate it. And it's a blast to be with you by the virtues of Zoom. So I want to talk about the book, but I also want to talk about the way in which the book came together and why. Because although it seems logical, it has its own origin stories, most of which wrap around a couple of things, one of which is sort of the larger social context. And secondly, the context of my classrooms. My students are really the recipients of this book and in some ways are the generative force behind it. As I was thinking about them during the pandemic, wondering about how they were doing, in part because of the pandemic, and in part for anyone who was living in Southern California, Northern California, or anywhere in the US West at the time, which was blowing up in fire. I was beginning to wonder about the genius of living in a state that is not only a state of drought, but also a state of fire and on fire. And so I'll just give you these sort of three touch points. 18 of the 20 most destructive fires have occurred in California since 2003, 19 of the largest, and 13 of the deadliest, which tells us something about the last 20 years. And the period between 2020 and 2021 had almost most of these vast fires. In fact, at one time between August and September 2020, four of the five largest fires ever to burn in the state were burning simultaneously, which is pretty terrifying. So I'm sitting in my office because I was able to do that. And I'm teaching in my office during the pandemic. And I'm wondering how to explain all of this to my students. And it occurred to me that I do a lot of teaching of primary sources, hence the documentary history. And was wondering about fire and like how could I document something that's so ephemeral and yet so dangerous? And so I started reading old texts, trying to figure out what people were then in back in the day were reading and who they read. And so really what I started to put together was a collection of what we call primary sources, you would call documentary evidence of one form or another, that led me to a couple of conclusions. The first part of the book, and let me sort of switch to this because that makes it a lot easier for you to see. The first part of the book really depends upon a context that I was not as fully familiar with as I should have been, but that's part of the job of doing research is to figure things out, which is how the Spanish colonists, as they invaded what they called Alta California, what did they think about fire? Well, it turns out in their diaries, they talked about what they encountered with great detail. They were really good observers. They didn't like what they were observing, but they were really good observers and really good at writing things down about that in their journals. And a couple of things that are really quite surprising, but then scientists have confirmed it, which is that indigenous peoples from San Diego north to the Bay Area were burning nonstop. The Forest Service currently has evidence that probably 4 to 10% of our state was burning annually. by indigenous fires. And they were burning for material goods and services. They were burning for ritual objects. They were burning to sort of to make a landscape their own. And so we can call it an indigenous landscape because they're really crafting it, really stewarding it for them, for themselves. And the Spanish figured that out very quickly, which is why one of them, Luzin here quoted, was the moment I saw it, I realized what I needed to have this section on the colonial intervention to be about, which is, as he said, the only way to civilize this race, as he imagined them to be not civilized, was by, quote, denaturalizing them. And what he meant by that was you had to take away fire from them so that they would become converted to as labor for sedentary agriculture, that is, plowing, and also converted to Catholicism and becoming the labor force for the missions that, as you know, were strung out along the coastline, running up to Monterey and up into the Bay Area. The notion that you could change a society by changing the ways in which it had already figured out how to live on this land meant that you could control the land and the people simultaneously. It turns out they're not the only ones to think about that. And about 100+ years later, what would become the Forest Service, then the Division of Forestry in the US Department of Agriculture, reached a very similar kind of conclusion that if we were ever to lay claim to and control the use of natural resources, in this case wood, they would also need to prohibit fire as the Spanish did. They did it a lot more effectively in some ways with a greater sense of control than perhaps the Spanish actually were able to produce. But here's one argument by the second chief of the Forest Service, Henry Graves, in 1920, that the Forest Service, as he says, must oppose with utmost vigor any system of protection that would wreck the growing forest. That is to say, any system that used fire to manage forests, which is, as you'll see in a moment, there is a series of folks who are making that, meant that from Graves's point of view, any fire is bad fire. All fire must be suppressed. And although they don't really have the technology, I mean, this is a great photograph of an adaptation of a Model T putting on a railroad so that you could move through forest and at least patrol for fire. Whether you could put them out from this rig, I don't know. But it's a testimony to the way by which this emerging federal agency understood its job, which is to suppress fire so that you, in this case, can grow Western pine. But all paradigms will have pushback and resistance. And at the same time that the Division of Forestry, later to be the US Forest Service, was beginning to articulate an ideology about why fire suppression was important, there were others who were saying, this doesn't make much sense. So Joaquin Miller, who now has a park up in the Oakland Hills, a poet, a fabulist, and a really great liar, by the way. You can never tell with him what is actually true about his life, but because he recounted it endlessly and in different ways, endlessly. Yet he left this piece of memoir in 1888 about the world that he had witnessed in the latter part of the 19th century, in which indigenous fire management practices still being produced, still generated. As he put it, in this way, the fire was always the servant, never the master. And that by this means, they kept the forest open, pure, and fruitful, and conflagrations were unknown. The Forest Service did not believe that for a moment, and I delve into that in various ways and show how that's the case. But Miller is not the only one who pushes back. Joseph Kitts, someone that very few people have ever heard of, is a forester who managed his forest using fire. He had watched and learned from indigenous people. He recognized the value of fire to reproducing certain kinds of pine species, lodgepole pine, for example, in the South, longleaf pine, and we'll talk about the South in a little bit. But here again, here is a white settler who recognized that, as he says, the Indians may not have had a very scientific view about why they were doing what they were doing, which, by the way, is not true. They had a real clear understanding of it. But we have to admit his methods of preservation and natural reproduction were highly successful when compared to our own results. And here is a white settler talking about the value of indigenous fire management in ways that one would have thought it's rare, but it turns out it's not. And a third perception, indigenous itself occurred in 1924. In the San Gabriel Mountains here, where I am, I'm right below the tallest of the San Gabriel Mountains, Mount Baldy, which is about 10,000 feet tall. In the 1920s, those mountains started to burn and burn large. In 22, 23, 24, where this story comes out, fires of more than 50,000 acres were erupting. As you can see from this very early photograph of the 1924 fire, there are actually three plumes burning simultaneously. You can see the valleys in between and beyond these mountains filled with smoke. In many ways, that fire smelled, looked, and acted like fires in January 25 in the Palisades and Altadena. And it's at that moment that the Mission Indian Federation in San Jacinto, California, sent a letter to President Coolidge suggesting, and this is the first time I've ever found any kind of evidence like this, that the federal government should return the land back to the Gabrielina Tongva and other Tongva people scattered throughout the Inland Empire because they knew how to manage these forests and had done so for millennia, 3 to 4,000 years in their own ancestry and obviously in prior groups before that. The USDA's response is both typical and fascinating in its own way. If properly trained, the response reads, they could qualify for positions in the Forest Service and might even be given considerable consideration for appointment. What's missing here, or really what's going on here, is like ships passing in the night. The indigenous knowledge that Forest Service disputed and dismissed was at the basis for why the Tongvan people were making the claim that they were making about their ability to manage fires like this, set against the more scientific forestry that the Forest Service itself was certain would stamp out these fires, which, as you know from that history between 2003 and 2025, demonstrates that fire suppression has in fact not been particularly effective. That doesn't stop the agencies, both state and federal, from pushing farther and sort of doubling down. In 1935, the U.S. Forest Service initiated what they call the 10 a.m. rule, which states the following, that when a firefighter or a lookout spots a fire, you need to put that fire out by 10 a.m. the next morning. And if you don't do that, then it should be 10 a.m. the next day. And if it's not that done, then it should be 10 o'clock the following day. It's a metric by which you judge the effectiveness of firefighting. And it puts pressure, obviously, on the firefighters to intercede immediately and to be as efficient as possible in stamping out all fire anywhere, every time. It's a bold ambition. It's rarely met because fire has its own ways of sort of creeping and moving and popping up in different ways. But it does tell you how committed the agency was to this position. But even when it doubles down, there are voices of discontent that always emerge and that I was able to find in a variety of regions in the United States, one of which most effectively is in the US South. And I stumbled upon this woman, Ellen called Long, in 1888, attended at the same time Joaquin Miller was speaking about the Yosemite. She was talking about fire practices in the South. She was the only woman to come to a National Forest Convention in 1881, the only woman to speak. And one of the things that she said was really quite striking, and I've highlighted it here, because as she understood, fire was absolutely an essential feature of longleaf pine forests, of which the South had many. And she understood, even though she's not a botanist, or at least not trained as a botanist, she doesn't go to college. She has, in what we would call that, a sort of experiential knowledge about the nature of forest fires and why they should not be abolished, because doing so would annihilate the great the grand lumbering pineries. Lodgepole pine, like longleaf pine, requires intense heat to explode the pine cones so that they then spray their seeds everywhere. The seeds then fall into the ash of the fire where there's a lot of resource nutrients in there and it helps them grow. It's a remarkable species, the longleaf pine. And Call, 140 years ago, understood what the Forest Service wouldn't really understand for another 50 or 60 in that regard. A second person, this guy, S.W. Green, was so provocative that even when he got published in one of the forestry magazines, the editor was so worried about the Forest Service striking back at them that they put an article in front of his and an article behind us, both of which critiqued what he was saying and also wrote an editorial at the beginning. So if you opened up the issue, by the time you got to Green's article where he said fire was not a master but a servant and it should be managed that way, and that was the lesson that the indigenous people could teach, by the time you got to that argument, you would be fully convinced that whatever he said had already been not criticized, but basically um, basically turned it non-existent, had been erased in terms of its capacity to convince you. The guy to the left is Herbert Stoddard, one of the great sort of fire proponents, and would produce in the South a remarkable organization called the Tall Pines Conferences beginning in the 1960s, where they just pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed for fire to be reintroduced in the South. And in time, it would be. And then much of that technique finally made its way to the West Coast. And often it was Southern fire managers who were brought west to sort of teach the Western foresters how to do the work that they had been doing in the South. And one of the things that really struck me going through a bunch of letters that were written to Gifford Pinchot, who was the first chief of the U.S. Forest Service, who during the late 1930s, while he was sort of almost retired, he never really stopped working, um, gathered up letters from folks he had hired back in the day, one of whom, from Alan Kalbeck, wrote to Pinchot in 1940 about his job and his work. And I spotted this remarkable declaration of how powerful a paradigm is inside an organization. And so he talks about why fire was actually really useful in Montana. It worked really, really well. And putting it out was probably not the best thing. As he said, it would clean the ground, which would allow a new stand to grow and flourish. But it was the final paragraph of his letter that really stuck out to me. Of course, he writes, I know a fellow probably could be shot if he advocated this, but nature is a pretty wise old girl, and when men try to improve on it, we generally get things unbalanced. The part about advocating something that he knew his peers would really be perturbed by is striking, because that's what paradigms do. They create such an internal consensus that it's very hard to break out of that consensus unless either outside forces or brave inside forces sort of drive this story apart. The other part of this, though, is that paradigms contain the seeds of their own disintegration. And I think that's partly what Kalbeck is pointing to. He knew what was wrong. He advocated to his former chief why what he knew was wrong. He might not have gone public with it, but other people did and would. And so by the 1950s and 60s, there's a new merging consensus that putting fire back on the ground was not the worst thing in the world. It actually could be quite useful for some species. And so if the South and that generation was starting to push this argument, there was another group that was also doing it. And the close of the book really focuses in on indigenous fire managers who hearken back to that 1924 letter, but who grew up in the same way, thinking that fire was an absolutely essential part of their life and livelihood and their people's practices. Bill Tripp, who is the fire manager of the Koruk people up in Northern California, in 2020, wrote an op-ed for The Guardian, which also was something that I saw in the midst of those firestorms that year, that summer, and saved it because I thought, oh my God, this has to go in the book. And look at the way he talks about fires. They are devastating, and yet what they're doing is also making folks realize why indigenous ancestors for millennia had burned and why and how it was that that practice must return. We'll continue to fight for our indigenous rights and tribal sovereignty to be taken seriously rights. The structural racism that is at the root of fire suppression took firebrands out of the hands of indigenous people, and thus the lives that they led in, say, the 1600s or the 1200s, or whenever we go back in time, had been disrupted. And what he feels as if he's doing, and here we have indigenous fire managers working here in Southern California, in San Diego, behind us here in the photograph, is every time you put fire in the ground, it is a match that lights the flame for tribal sovereignty and reclamation. What I've also included in the book are the ways in which the California state legislature has started to shift the incentives in terms of fire, where once the incentives all rolled towards fire suppression, they're now beginning to argue that cultural burns, what Don Blake calls cultural burns, as does all the other indigenous fire managers in the book, uses that same terms, because it's not just about putting fire on the land to beat back larger fires, that is to burn small fires to lessen the capacity of large ones to burn. It is also a way by which to steward a practice of fire management across time. And what Bill Tripp and Don Blake and others have said in their various op-eds and essays and professional articles is they talk about how they came to this knowledge. And the way they speak of it is very familial. They learned from their grandmother how to burn. They learned from their uncle or aunt how to burn. Those progenitors learned from others before them, and stretching back in time. And so although the Spanish thought they were stamping out fire and the knowledge of fire, and although the Forest Service thought it was doing the same thing for everybody, not just indigenous people, it turns out that traditional ecological knowledge, which includes putting fire on the ground to produce all sorts of goods and services, and to generate a kind of indigenous sovereignty, that never left. The oral histories that emerge in the book are only a small number, a smattering of those that I ran into. I mean, a book can only be so long. But it was a powerful way for me to think about the way in which the past can reassert itself, even though we think it's over. In this case, it wasn't. It was a powerful way for me to think about how I could teach this to my students, which is to not teach it. That is to say, to give them the same primary sources, have them read them, have them ultimately get to Don Blake and Bill Tripp and Michael Misquish Connolly in San Diego, and read their essays and realize there is these moments in time where ideas seem to flourish, get stamped down, and then pop back up again, much like the trees that desperately need fire to regenerate themselves. It was a really wonderful project to work on. I've been working with my students on with the data that I gathered for burn scars for the last 2 years. It came out in October 24. And I have to say, and I couldn't have predicted this, though I'm thrilled that it happened. The discussions that these texts and many others that I'm not showing you tonight has produced has been some of the best I've had in many, many years. And it's partly because they were great students, to be sure, but also because the fascination with fire and that it has a history embedded within human life seems to them to be both really crucial, but also it's a fun way to learn. to sort of put your hands on documents that haven't been read in 150, 250 years, and to watch their eyes light up and watch the seminar table sort of explode in conversation. I couldn't have predicted that in 2020 when I started working on the book. I'm thrilled that that's been the result of it. And it sort of makes the project worth every while to be able to talk with you and other groups about why fire matters, why fire management matters, and why we need to be thinking about this, especially in a state like California, which seems to have extraordinary firestorms virtually every year. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Miller. That was lovely. Um, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute themselves or place it in the chat. Um, I will perhaps kick things off,
Sure.
Dr. Miller, with a question.
Yeah.
I'm curious I wrote some things down. What hurdles do you see kind of indigenous fire managers, or what do they still face when attempting to reintroduce cultural burning practices to uh, their ancestral lands as well as just like to the kind of the mainstream? Does that make any
Yeah,
sense?
no, no, that makes perfect sense, and they are quite clear about what some of those hurdles are. One of the people that I have worked with at the Autry Museum here in Los Angeles um, is is a Ron Good is a North Fork Mono, which is sort of central Sierra mountain tribe, and they have been very successful at putting fire on the ground. They actually don't have reservation land up in the Sierra, but these are their ancestral lands. But to get them to be able to fight fire, they have to talk to the county, which has to approve it. The state has to approve it. The Forest Service has to approve it, or the National Park Service, depending on who's owning that property. And then they all have to look at the weather, right? And understandably so, because if the winds are galing off of, the Pacific and blasting into the Sierra, not a good time to come out with the sticks that set these fires up, as you can see here in the photograph. Um, but they do get the fire on the ground, and it does exactly what they want it to do. So Michael Misquish down in San Diego has been burning on the very small campos, which are kinds of reservations for the Kumeyaay people. Um, and he understood immediately that the key to fire was to help reproduce, regenerate springs and water flow. And so they fenced off from cattle and started burning. And within 10 years, all sorts of plants had come up that had not been there in 100 years. And all of a sudden, I mean, it almost is magical. Put fire back under the ground, protect it from grazing in the case of southern San Diego County, eastern San Diego County, and water starts coming up out of the ground. It's like amazing stuff. And then they've started to rebuild the streams and creeks so that they are able to replicate the riffles and pools that used to be there. They're not going to get, fish coming up out of the Pacific necessarily, but they are starting to replicate, just as Ron Good was doing up in the Sierra, and certainly Don Blake and Bill Tripp, um, starting to use fire. So, for example, in the Karuka and Hupa peoples, it was women who set fire to burn particular shrubs that they would use to make their baskets, hazel as an example. Well, they never lost that knowledge. They were still burning. They just couldn't burn at scale. And now the goal is really let's scale this up to the degree that we're able to do so. Um, Prescribed fire and cultural burns isn't going to solve the whole problem that California faces. But because it had been banned for so long, it's like a huge victory that there is even any headway. So the hurdles are intense. The pushback remains, but the state has legitimized and incentivized cultural burns in ways that had never done before. since 1850 when it was outlawed. So, if it takes us 160 years to get there, at least we got there.
Great. Thank you, Doctor. We do have a hand raised by Tammy. Tammy, if you wanted to unmute yourself, feel free to do so if you wanted to ask your question.
Oh, I saw the fire from the news from Los Angeles. It
Uh-huh.
was so big. It was huge. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I saw a fire from California at Morgan Hill. I
Uh-huh.
saw that a lot.
Yeah. And, one of I can't say that fire suppression flashed the Palisades and Altadena fire or the Camp Fire or any of the other major ones. The Camp Fire probably, but the Los Angeles one's not. Um, and that's a whole nother set of issues. And it's actually stuff that I've been trying to convince local politicians to do, which is given that we're having these massive array of fires, and this is true in Santa Cruz as it is in Los Angeles, as it is in the Sierra and Lake County and lots of different places that have been burning routinely. We know that those are high severity fire zones, and yet we greenlight housing developments inside them, and we're shocked when they go up in flames. And so, some of that is our own hubris, our own sort of arrogance about, well, look, we can control everything. And it's the same arrogance that says, let's build on every sand island off of Florida, and then they get knocked over by hurricanes or, Houston floods. Well, it's sitting in the middle of marshland. That's not a real surprise. But we've not been very good about sort of controlling where we go and where we grow and how we grow and where we live. And so the fires that you're talking about, Tammy, is also embedded in and a result of sort of a outward migration, a suburbanization of places that where we probably shouldn't be living.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mhm.
To that point, Dr. Miller, I'm curious, do you have any kind of resources or preventative measures, as it were, to limit the or that would what am I trying to ask? Are there preventative measures, being that, we do live in these areas,
Yeah,
that anyone
yeah,
can take to limit the risk of
yeah.
fire?
So that's the key is trying to limit risk, which means you accept the risk. That's the first thing. Anybody who lives in the Oakland Hills or the foothills of the Sierra or down here in Southern California, you have to acknowledge to yourself, I'm moving into a place that's at risk. And whether it's a floodplain or a fire zone, you've got to be upfront with yourself. And then there are things you can do, right? But it's only minimizing the risk. It's not eliminating the risk. So one of the things that I tell friends who have sort of bought in those landscapes is look, do a circle your house and walk out 20 feet, walk out 40 feet, walk out 60 feet. And depending on the size of your property, get out to the property line and note what's there. So you're looking for landscape. Are there shrubs? Are there trees? Are they overhanging your house? Well, that's a ladder fuel. If a fire hits, it's going to come into your roof and game over. Um, Do you have a wooden porch that extends from your house? If you do, you shouldn't, because that's ladder fuel. You could have concrete, but not wood. If you've got overhanging eaves, in some cases, and in Los Angeles, this is true, it's no longer up to code to have overhanging eaves, because if you have an overhanging eave like this, and fire gets up into the place where the eave connects with the fire is inside the roof, and the moment that happens, the house is gone. And the firefighters, frankly, know that, and they're going to move on to some other place that's not burning. So there are things you can do to be proactive. There are now efforts to sort of think about how to what's called harden the home to make it more difficult. And some of that means getting rid of various kinds of roofing materials that burn. Smart idea. But also to build with different kinds of materials, maybe more concrete, possibly that could work. Um, but there's those kinds of things. There are other sort of mechanisms. And the other thing is, and I had a sister who lived up in Auburn, who lived in this gorgeous hill loaded with oak trees, absolutely beautiful landscape. It was an oak grassland, total fire trap because there was one way in and one way out. And every June we'd have these conversations. And all she can really do is to mow the grassland. The oaks are just too beautiful. And she did take down some that were around her house, which I think was helpful. But really, at that point, whenever you come back to your house, you point your car downhill with a go bag in it already. I mean, it sounds crazy, but given the danger of living there, maybe your evacuation risk can be reduced by so doing. So think about this. The Altadena fire was moving a mile every 6 minutes. So if you lived a mile away from the fire, you only had 6 minutes at best to make a series of decisions about whether you're going to live or die. That's really fast. So if you already have your car gassed up and you already have your go bag, there's no question about what you do. Grab your pets, maybe. Grab whatever you feel is most important. It should already have been in the car and ready to go because everybody else is going to be going at the same time. And that was the dilemma that my sister faced and a lot of other places have faced in these one road in, one road out things, which is as you're going downhill, the firefighters are coming uphill. Is the road wide enough for the two of you to gain passage? And in some cases in the Oakland Hills, for example, it isn't. So this is a really scary situation, which is why, evacuation orders almost always should be mandatory and not voluntary because you're not going to have the time to get out. So I think there's some really practical things you can do with the house itself, with the landscape around the house. And the state has just enacted new codes for zero landscaping within 5 feet of your house. But honestly, 5 feet isn't enough because if you've got a bush and it's on fire and the wind is blowing, the flames are going to go more than 5 feet. In fact, the flame lengths during the Altadena and Pasadena fire were well over 200 feet. That's literally like a flamethrower throwing flame 200 feet, almost a football in length. That's just scary as all get out, and you don't have a lot of time to move. So A, I wouldn't move there, but B, if you do, take every precaution necessary.
It's a great reminder for personal emergency preparedness,
Yeah.
albeit a scary one.
Mhm.
We have some questions in the chat for you. We have one from Priya asking, does the recent global warming have an impact on how people are using controlled fires in forests? Question mark.
Oh, what a great question. Yeah, so that's actually, thank you for that. That's really great. Because there are all sorts of dynamics, right? There isn't just you put fire on the ground and things are fine. It's like, when do you have the chance to do that and why? And so with climate change, especially in the Sierra, and actually from the Sierra South, the entire Southwest has been drying out since 1985. So now have 40 years of a drought, slowly taking water out of this area. I mean, we're getting rain. Don't get me wrong. You guys just got it. We just got it. But it's also coming in intensities that mean it's falling in different ways than it once did. And because it's a long-term drought, and drought seems to be coming more to have a bigger hold on places from El Paso west to San Diego and north, then a fire regime in, say, in and around Yosemite is a lot more dangerous than it once was. So the Park Service is really good about putting fire back on the ground, but they are watching it like crazy because we don't know the full extent of climate change and the drying out that comes from that. This is a disruptive process. So what we once was history, this is how it always happens. It's no longer happening that way. And let me give you an example from the Eastern Sierra, which the Forest Service used to think of as the asbestos side, the place that never burned. Well, it's now burning a lot and in ways that we've never seen before. The sage, what one historian has called the ocean of sage, is now getting so desiccated that the moment any fire is in there, what used to be small fires are now 20, 25,000. That's not as big as they are on the western slope of the Sierra. It's a lot bigger than what they're used to. There was just a fire shortly after it snowed in the mountains in and around Mammoth, and it was only 3,000 acres. It burned 28 buildings, houses. So we've got a climate that is sort of flexing and moving in ways that we don't fully appreciate. So yes, you're absolutely right, Priya. That puts another pressure on those who would like to put fire back on the ground in larger scale ways. But boy, does it have to be done really carefully.
Thank you so much. We have another question from Kathy. You mentioned that 19 out of the 20 largest fires in California occurred between 2003 and 2025. Just curious, do you know when the 20th was? Little trivia question.
Ooh, 19 of 20. So which one was it? Yes, it was a fire in 1935. And I don't remember the name of it. And they didn't often always name fires in the 30s, but I'm gonna have to go look at that one. But it was massive. It was 200,000 acres, which in 1935 was mind-blowing in terms of its size. There had been bigger fires much earlier, but the speed with which this process has sort of gone in the direction that it has gone and in the size and the numbers of which it's happened just blows my mind. And it's one of the reasons why, for me, the book became it became a lesson for myself. Obviously, I was doing it because I wanted to publish a book about it, but I learned so much in the process of the sort of not just the dangers, which I thought I had a pretty good handle on, but why things have unfolded the way they have in a policy sense. And this is really a book about policy in the end. Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you.
And then Dr. Miller, you may have touched on it a bit earlier, but speaking of policy, based on the lessons and the findings in the book, in your opinion, just kind of cap things off, what are the most urgent policy changes that you would want to see for current wildfire management, kind of moving forward? What are the biggest things we should maybe be focusing on?
Yeah, I think some of it is we've got to figure out how to live with fire. All of those sort of counter voices, the counter narratives that emerged in the 1880s saying, look, this fires are actually really useful for a lot of reasons. Indigenous people, yes, and foresters also, and Stoddard, who I showed you earlier from the 1930s, he was trying to reproduce quail habitat, and lots of species need fire, not just trees, but others need sort of clear and open habitat like the quail does. So if we're going to be environmental stewards, we need to be thinking ecologically about the role that fire plays and try to, where we can, re-engage with it in ways that don't threaten the world that we have also built. But policy for me, the most important piece of it would be to sort of advocate for, and I've been doing this for the last 10 years, not very effectively, as it turns out, but I've been advocating that at the county and city levels where development developers go to get permits, it's not at the state level, it's at the county and city levels. They really have to stop immediately green lighting developments in high severity fire zones. It's not that hard. You just say no. And what you do is and one of the ways to play that is to incentivize what I think should be happening. And Los Angeles is a good example of this. Los Angeles is as sprawled as you can imagine a place to be. We've now gone deep into the Mojave Desert. What if we incentivized building up and not out? What if, and LA is starting to get more and more dense. It's actually the city of Los Angeles. The county of LA is, I think, the most dense county in the country at this point. But there's a periphery. and it's a vast periphery. There's 20 million people down here. So what if we started to build up, and it does not fly well in suburban Southern California because suburban Southern California is based on, 1 and 2 story houses that spread out across a landscape. But those are the 1 and 2 houses like in Altadena and the Palisades that 16,000 homes were burned in a day. 16,000. This is not a wildfire. We have turned wildfires into structure fires. And the only way we're going to flip that relationship is to stop building houses at a density like that in places that we already know burn and burn frequently. I mean, the Palisades, the Santa Monica Mountains in which the Palisades are located, there were 2 fires, November and December, before the January fires, and they were big and they burned houses and they scared people like crazy. So it's not unusual. And the problem is we did this to ourselves. So maybe policy is a way to stop us from doing stuff that we know we shouldn't be doing, but we really, really want to do it.
Very true. Um, Doctor, if our patrons or our attendees want to learn more, what are some kind of immediate resources that you would recommend?
Well, I think there's, CAL FIRE, which is the firefighting force for California, has some really good materials online in terms of defensible space and, house codes and what you can do to protect yourself if you live in one of these, grasslands or oak savannas or up in the mountains themselves, or you have a second home in a place like that, which would be lovely, but also dangerous. CAL FIRE is really good with that. There are local fire departments know about this. I mean, in the peninsula, which is not, get down to Santa Cruz, and they've had some humongous fires recently. So I would be talking with fire departments. I would be talking to CAL FIRE and reading up on some of its initiatives. I think it should be more robust than it is, but what it is what we've got. So go there. I think Burn Scars is I'm not selling the book, but I would say that I think it was for me, it has been for my students, and from what I gather from those who have worked their way through it, a really effective way by which to start to think historically about fire that it turns out has an enormous role to play in our present management. And that was the unstated purpose of this, to help people see how we got to where we are, and then to use Indigenous voices and to let them speak about both the needs for Indigenous nations to reassert their claim to fire and what we can learn from those claims. So I think there's a lot of ways to sort of pursue this, but I think that's where I would start.
We have one more question in the chat before we officially wrap things up.
Sure.
Kathy again asked, do fire zone maps exist to the extent flood zone maps are available for real estate and insurance purposes? Kind of.
Yeah, they do. And that's a great question. CAL FIRE has just released an updated series of fire zone maps, and they're pretty good. Um, and you look at that and you go, huh, that overlays all of Sacramento's suburbs, all of Los Angeles's suburbs. I mean, you look at it and it gets a little scary. There are 8 million people in a state of 38 million people who live in high severity fire zones. The city of Los Angeles has 1 million alone. So we've done a really good job of pushing communities into places that burn in the ways that, as you say, Kathy, there are great floodplain maps that USGS and other federal and state agencies have. And this is important. In the Mississippi River floodplain, you cannot get insurance. So you can't build unless you want to go without a mortgage. And that's another thing that I think will actually save us, is if insurance companies refuse to underwrite new housing in high severity fire zones. They have an obligation to people that already have insurance, in my mind. But new housing, they have no such obligation. And if the market says no, it isn't going to be built. And for developers, if their customers can't get a mortgage, why would they invest in a property? They wouldn't. And so, I think there's different ways we can attack this. But yes, I think looking at those fire zone maps, and you can drill down because they're digital, you can get down to the block face, and unfortunately, it might be a little upsetting to see what you find.
Yeah, I imagine that's the case.
Yeah.
Uh, Dr. Miller, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really a treat to have you with us tonight. Um, for our audience, if you have not already done so, the library does have Dr. Miller's book, Burn Scars, as part of the collection. So please go ahead and check that out, and perhaps check out the rest of his work as well. The book is Burn Scars, a documentary history of the fire suppression from colonial origins to the resurgence of cultural burning. Thank you so much, Doctor, again for being here tonight. We really appreciate it. And thank you all for attending. Have a wonderful rest of your night and hope to see you all soon.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.